This way, my friends. Get your shrinkola right here, your one-way trip to Wonderland. For today's Wonderland journey, we're following Betty Boop down the rabbit hole to Blunderland. And yes, this might get confusing because I too am Betty Boop. But honestly, it fits the surreal vibe of the Fleischer brothers' approach to animation, in which anything can, and probably will, turn into multiples, or into something else entirely. Betty in Blunderland was released in April 1934, just a few months before the Hays Code came in to rein in Betty's moral unruliness. And so we get an unrestrained Betty Boop as our inquisitive, adventurous Alice. Betty Boop is still a transgressive figure if you ask me.
Hey, what do you think of this one, huh? Isn't she always a favorite? Get a grip, guy viewers. Betty Boop's here, decked out in seasonal red. And get this, she's a dangerous female.
Betty has a point of view, and we're invited to identify with her. And yet she's also obviously on erotic display. Sometimes she makes it clear she's very uncomfortable with being spectacle. Sometimes she seems to enjoy it.
Miss Betty, will you say something for the Paramount News?
Sure, Mike.
And she's a character with transformation at her core. Here she slips from Betty to Alice and back again. In Fleischer cartoons, a body is never static, never just one thing. And Betty is no exception.
Something.
Betty often plays out anxieties about the modern girl and even the young immigrant daughter, caught between her parents' world and the pull of the new mechanized popular culture.
Meet me under your window.
Okay.
We see this in famous Boop shorts like Minnie the Moocher, where Betty runs away because her parents don't understand her modern desires.
Tell me first, why you don't eat your husband, Papa?
And it's here in the aesthetics of Blunderland, folding modern details of urban working life into Carol's Wonderland nonsense. Betty in Blunderland is part of a long history of using Wonderland for satire, not making fun of Alice itself, the way Sherlock Holmes parodies poked fun at the Holmes stories, but rather using Alice in Wonderland as a frame to critique something else. After all, people read the original Wonderland stories like that too, as political satire and cultural critique. Wonderland is invitingly capacious, almost begging to be dropped into all sorts of different contexts, and used for a wide range of satiric targets. That's why it keeps getting reused. Wonderland's just so flexible. But in this short, Betty is not just in Wonderland, but specifically in Blunderland. And I think it's worth unpacking Blunderland as a concept. Betty Boop didn't invent Blunderland, and neither did the Fleischer brothers. Blunderland existed from early on in Alice in Wonderland's history. Perhaps most notably, John Tenniel himself illustrated a satiric cartoon for Punch magazine in 1880, entitled Alice in Blunderland, which mocked British politicians for plunking a big monument right next to Parliament, despite widespread objection that it would make traffic even worse. So the term Blunderland is linguistic play. It replaces wonder with blunder, suggesting a land or a social or political landscape that's already full of blunders. So why then Betty in Blunderland? Is it just for the sake of alliteration? Or is Betty in Blunderland social critique? And if so, how? Betty in Blunderland opens with a frame quite different than any we've seen so far in our Alice journey. When we meet her, Betty is not Alice, but rather an Alice consumer, an Alice fan. She's relaxing in the evening by putting together a Wonderland puzzle, which turns out to be her gateway to Wonderland, or rather, Blunderland. As she's putting the puzzle together, she closes her eyes for a minute, which as we know is the Alice adaptation signal for we've entered the dream. Now the normal rules don't apply. The white rabbit piece she's holding slips out of her grasp and transforms into a real, well, animated rabbit. While her eyes are closed, the rabbit heads out all business through the looking glass. Betty follows, and as she looks in the mirror, she transforms into Alice herself. Well, an approximation, because she still has her signature black hair. It's just longer, and she's wearing Alice's iconic hairband. I love this moment. It's such a direct visualization of how we insert ourselves into Wonderland, identifying with Alice. Remember, we even talked about this when we were looking at the magic lantern slides that added her into the image as a stand-in for us. Once she's in Wonderland, Alice names all of the various Wonderland inhabitants with delight.
Oh, the Duchess, and the Froggy, and Humpty Dumpty, and the Mock Turtle, and the March Hare, and everybody yelled.
Many of them emerge harmlessly from the Hatter's hat. Characters who in the original book, and most adaptations, are more threatening, the Duchess, the Caterpillar, here are greeted with joy, like old friends.
Everyone, how do you do? The cook in the kitchen and the Duchess too. The dormouse and the teapot and the Mad Hatter too. How do you do? Ooh.
But let's back up, because walking through the Looking Glass is not how Betty gets into Blunderland, or for that matter, Looking Glass World. Rather, there's this kind of double, no make it triple, entry situation. First, she needs to transform into Betty Alice through the Looking Glass. Ooh, when you put it that way, it's a really nice metaphor for watching movies, or for the transformative power of animation. And only then, once she's on the other side of the mirror, does she have access to the rabbit hole, and the fall that will land her in Wonderland or Blunderland proper. But here the rabbit hole isn't really a rabbit hole, but rather a subway entrance. And then once she's fallen down the subway station rabbit hole, there's a third barrier for her to overcome, that of size. That's in the original and the adaptations we've looked at so far too, of course. Alice needs to experiment with eating and drinking various potions, cookies, and mushrooms to be the right size to enter the garden, or the White Rabbit's house, and so forth. But for Blunderland, it's a different story. It's not just Alice who needs to drink a transformative potion, it's most everyone. This is where the Shrinkola comes in, a mechanized contraption that looks like a beer tap, and anyone who wants to clock into Blunderland needs to down the bubbly brew, so that they'll shrink to fit into the Blunderland entryway. There's many more signs of urban and mechanized life too. When Betty falls, on purpose mind you, through the subway rabbit hole, she falls through an urban immigrant landscape of laundry hanging out to dry. As she falls, she grabs a jar of jam, not marmalade, so an Americanized version, and Ed Wynn, vaudeville performer turned radio and TV personality and eventually Mad Hatter for Disney, even pops out of the jam jar. Likewise, the Mad Hatter drinks tea with a factory-like efficiency by spinning the table. This is almost the opposite of the book, where the Hatter and friends have to move themselves to get more tea. And also there appears to be a plethora of tea rather than a lack in this industrial, mechanism-happy Blunderland. Tweedledee and Tweedledum turn into dual Babe Ruths smacking baseball bats at each other, suggesting distinctly American origins, rather than the British schoolboy stereotypes they originally embodied. Likewise, the Duchess becomes a vaudeville-style dancing spectacle, rather than an authority figure terrorizing her baby pig hybrid. It's the Duchess's feet rather than the baby that transform into animals and back. Across this whole Alice journey, we've talked about Wonderland as modular. Remember the Alice Magic Lantern slides that were in subsets? Or the 1903 silent film that was sold in whole or parts? Betty in Blunderland puts this logic into overdrive. All of these iconic pieces of Wonderland are mixed up and pulled out of the Hatter's hat, much to Betty's joy. In the original stories, many of these figures represented the threat or illogic of adult authority. But here they're rendered a harmless collective.
You and you and you and you, the king in the palace and the princess too, the turtle in the water and the lion in the zoo. How do you? Poo-poo-poo-doo-poo.
So if the queen's off with your head is no longer even a momentary threat, where does the narrative tension come from? Well, the short imports a different narrative structure, the threat of the monster running off with the girl. The Jabberwocky, who in the book is contained to a poem, here erupts from the Hatter's hat, on the same level of existence as the other Blunderlanders, and runs off with Betty King Kong style. And I mean, yes, in this moment, Betty seems a lot more helpless than Alice ever does. But the Jabberwocky danger is short-lived, a performative thrill like a roller coaster ride. And it doesn't take long for Betty and Wonderlanders together to fall off the cliff, landing in a big partying heap, no more the worse for wear. So what could have been narrative threat becomes collective play. And then, with a match cut dissolve, we return to Betty's apartment, where Betty is once again herself, an Alice fan with control over the Wonderland jigsaw puzzle. Though, the White Rabbit does try to get away again. So, kind of like at the end of Labyrinth, we have Betty as a modern girl, coexisting with the power of imagination and play, plus the metamorphic ability of animation embodied in the Fleischer style. The cartoon may let go of some of Alice's stubborn refusal of authority, but it also depicts Betty as ultimately in control as a consumer fan, and as finding joy in the collective imagination of Wonderland. Betty's unruliness, which the Hays Code would soon attempt to contain, here finds form in her power as a participant in media culture, and in the shared popular imaginary of Alice in Wonderland. So that's our trip to Blunderland, Shrinkola and all. For our next Wonderland journey, I've got two very different possibilities in mind: Jan Schwanke-Meyer's stop-motion fever dream or anime Wonderland. Let me know in the comments, which one do you want first? And if you vote anime, name one episode or film you'd like me to start with. See you down the next rabbit hole.